All right, good afternoon, students. We're going to get started because we got a lot to cover. So welcome back to campus. I hope you had a good fall break. And before I get started, there's two things that I want to explain. Number one, I've been here for all of the Common Hour presentations. I think they've been splendid. I think we've all learned a lot through the Common Hour presentations. But one thing I've noticed is that during the Common Hour presentations, when we try to break down into smaller groups or class sections, things just get really chaotic, I've noticed. And when they get a little chaotic, it might be the case that some students are engaged or maybe others not so much. So I'm not going to do that today. So instead, what I'm going to do is provide all of us with a hard copy of a common reading. It's a one-page thing. It's not very long. So what I want all class sections to do is to find one person from your class section, come down front on this table, and there are stacks of printouts for your section. So find your section, return to your section, and then kind of distribute the hard copy to all of your classmates. All right, so once you get this reading, there's something I need to explain about it. It's kind of a strange situation in that I've asked everyone, and we're going to take a look at this together, and I'm going to use it as an example during my presentation. But it's odd. I haven't given you this reading because it's a good reading. I've given you this reading because it's really, really not good. In fact, one could just argue it's just plain old bad. And so I've been teaching the intellectual standards for years. It used to be a part of our Gen 101 curriculum. I'll explain that in a second. But over the years, some of the instructors for Gen 101 learned that one of the best ways of teaching students the intellectual standards is to have them analyze a reading that maybe is challenged in some ways, that's really not very good. And this reading is just something that we kind of trawled up from the internet about 10 or 12 years ago. And it's just thoroughly bad. And the term that we used to use is that it's so bad that it's craptastic. And therefore, it's kind of useful. You might be surprised to learn that sometimes it's hard to find a reading that's really that bad for teaching the students the intellectual standards, okay? So we're going to use this several times during the presentation. I'll draw your attention to a particular paragraph or a particular line, and then we'll just kind of read it together, okay? All right, so let's get started, and I want to introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Matthew Szromba. I'm an associate professor of history. I've been teaching at Marian for a really long time, 19 years now, and teaching full-time for more than 20 years. Obviously, I spend most of my time teaching history, but I have another role here at the university that I want to mention to everyone, and that is I serve as the faculty director of study abroad. The reason why I mention that is if you have any interest in study abroad, you'd like to learn more about your options, you'd like to learn more about how study abroad works and where you might be able to study and for how long, I want to offer the opportunity to meet with me. So send me an email. I'm happy to set up an appointment with you. Or you can just drop by my office. So my office is on the 3rd floor of the Agnes Building, A309, okay? Next, so I serve as an instructor for SCP 100, Section 3 back there. I was expecting a little bit of love from my section, but not really. but also I think at least 6 or 7 times I taught Gen 101. You might have heard that Gen 101 was a previous iteration of the SCP 100 course. So Gen 101 was a previous version of the first year experience course. We taught it for years. So I know the Gen 101 curriculum, I know the SCP 100 curriculum as well. They're really kind of different from one another, okay? And last academic year, I served on a committee. It was a pretty large committee. It was 10, 12, maybe 15 people. And we spent nearly the entire academic year talking about SCP 100. Trying to figure out the curriculum for this year for SCP 100. And I played a small role in helping to design that. We debated lots of things. What should SCP 100 do and how do we want to accomplish it? One of the things I was really pleased about, though, was that we retained a very small portion of the Gen 101 curriculum. That is, teaching the intellectual standards, or C.R.A.P. Clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision. You might ask the question, well, why are you so pleased that you retain this small portion of the curriculum? Well, I'm going to tell all of you the exact same thing I used to tell my Gen 101 students for years. And that is this, that if all SCP 100 students hold themselves to account for the intellectual standards of clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision, you are 90% of the way towards achieving a satisfactory grade in all of your university courses. I don't know if you think I'm kind of overstating the case or exaggerating. I don't think I am. I really mean that. If you hold yourself to account for these standards, you're 90% of the way towards achieving a satisfactory grade. Now, I do want to point out, I said satisfactory. I didn't say what? I didn't say excellent or outstanding, but at least a C, right? And I'm further going to make the observation that you earn at least a C in all of your university classes, you're going to be a successful college student, right? And that's what SCP 100 is all about. It's not the only thing that it's about, but it's partly about making you a successful college student, okay? So what I'm going to argue is that the intellectual standards are absolutely key or crucial to your success. All right, so what exactly are the intellectual standards? So I'm going to begin with making like a really basic observation, but I still think it's an important one, and that is words matter. Words are never inconsequential in any of your academic work. We use words to think. We use words to speak. Just like I'm speaking to you now, just like you'll have to speak in your classes when you have to give an in-class presentation. We obviously use words when we're writing out paper assignments, right? We use words in all of our academic work. And thus, it's important for all of us to use the right words at the right times to make sure that our thinking and our speaking and our writing measure up to the intellectual standards, to the highest academic standards. And if we fail to do that, if we fail to use the right word at the right time, but instead use the almost right word, we're going to end up in a situation just like Mark Twain described, is that we use the almost right word, and that can be the difference between using lightning and lightning bug. I know it's kind of a silly example, but there are some striking similarities between lightning on the one hand and lightning bug on the other. It's a very small difference, but man, what an important difference it really is, okay? All right, so write this out, right? This is what I'm going to recommend, is taking some notes here. And here's your definition for the intellectual standards. And all of the SCP 100 sections are going to be working on this week, so take some good notes here. The intellectual standards are defined as follows, right? They are basic measures, basic benchmarks that indicate, that signify if our thinking, our speaking, and our writing is clear, relevant, accurate, and precise. So these are basic standards, basic measures, basic benchmarks to help to ensure that all of our thinking, our speaking, and writing is clear, relevant, accurate, and precise. And if the words that we use for thinking, speaking, and writing do not meet these required standards, then that means that we're not speaking and communicating effectively. And I want to argue here that our goal as a university community, I don't want to single out students here, right? These intellectual standards are as important to me and to my faculty colleagues and to members of staff and to university administration. They're as important to us as they are important to you. That's how much they matter. As a university community, collectively, we want to work towards effective communication and thinking. Next, I wouldn't blame all of you for thinking to yourselves right now as, as we're moving forward in the presentation, well, that's great, Dr. Szromba, but I'm not an English major, so what damn difference does this make to me, right? Why should words matter that much if I'm not an English major? And what I assert is that these intellectual standards matter so much because they're a key to your academic success, but I want to go beyond that, and I want to argue they're a key to your future professional success. How so? In what sort of way? So let me ask a question. How many nursing majors do we have in the room? Raise your hand. All right, so maybe a dozen or 15. All right, so let's say that you successfully complete your degree at Marian. You parlay your nursing degree into a nursing job. It's your dream job in the future. What could potentially happen if, while working as a nurse, you fail to communicate with clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision? People could get hurt. We could even say maybe worse than that. People could what? Die. I don't think I'm exaggerating. If you're supposed to deliver 5 milligrams of medication to a patient and you deliver 50 instead because you're not measuring things accurately, you might kill someone. Finance majors. Is there a finance major or two in the room? Raise your hand. What happens when finance majors fail to communicate or think with clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision? People lose money. Your clients lose money. Your company loses money. How much money, Mr. Lowe? Could be a lot. Could be millions of dollars, right? How long are you going to have that job if you're losing the company and clients millions of dollars? Probably only a couple days, right? Construction management majors, where are you? There's got to be a few here. All right, construction management. What happens when you do not speak with clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision as a construction management major? I don't think you're going to kill anybody in this case, actually, because hopefully the architects or the engineers are going to catch some sort of problem, but what's likely to happen? You're managing a project.
The building falls.
Well, no, we're we're thinking that the architects and the engineers are going to catch that, right? But your project could what? Go over schedule by several weeks or months. It could go over budget by millions of dollars. And if that's the case, how long are you going to have that job? Not for very long. Social work majors, where are you? There's got to be a few. All right, there's one up there, right? What happens when you handle a child welfare case without clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision? Well, I'm not sure if we want to go galloping off to death, but you could send a child back to an abusive home, right? And they could die as a result, right? Forensic science majors, what happens when you fail to write a case summary with accuracy, precision, clarity, and relevance? Criminals go free? Innocent people are convicted of crimes, right? So I don't know if I've convinced you, right, that this is important to your success here at Marian, but I would argue that it's really important for you all to get into the habit of applying these standards to all of your thinking and speaking and writing so that these sorts of things don't happen in your professional future, okay? All right, let's move on here. So the goal here, when it comes to the intellectual standards, of course, is for you to apply these standards to your own work, to your own thinking, your own speaking, and your own writing. But I don't want to pretend here that this is easy. It's not. This is a struggle, and it's a struggle for everyone. I brought a prop to help illustrate that, that it's a struggle for everyone. So, brought along the only printed copy of my dissertation that I have, okay? It's long, it's 369 pages long, right? So I had to write this in order to complete and earn my PhD. It took me 5 years to write it. Now, I'm not bringing this up so somehow I could like impress you with the number of pages I wrote or the length of time that it took me to write it. In fact, I'm using this as a prop to demonstrate to you that this took me 5 years because every single word of this was a struggle for me. Every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every page was a struggle. It is really difficult to think and to write and to communicate with clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision. That's why it took me so long. I think I ended up erasing more pages of text than were actually included in the text, in the final version of the text, okay? So, like I said, this is hard for everyone. One way of applying or getting used to applying these standards to your own work, and this is what we're going to be doing in the Scoop 100 sections this week, is to apply these standards of clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision to other people's thinking. And in doing that, what you're doing is kind of measuring how do they measure up, either more or less, to the intellectual standards. And in the process, it's going to be necessary for all of you to give honest feedback, to give constructive feedback to whoever is doing the thinking or the writing or the speaking. In my experience, this is really hard for students to do. And in teaching Gen 101 for years, what I came to realize is that many students are reluctant to do this because it feels so mean. Because it feels like you're maybe picking on someone by giving them constructive feedback, by pointing out the flaws in their thinking or in their writing. It feels like you're hating on someone for the sake of hating on someone. And I'm going to argue that that is just simply not the case. For the last 100 years, people have been arguing that universities around this country, they act as a marketplace of ideas. Now that's a metaphor, right? A marketplace of ideas, that all of us come to this marketplace at the university where there are our own ideas and our own opinions. And then we try to sell them, or we might buy the ideas or opinions of someone else, right? But in that marketplace, your ideas have to stand up to a test. Your ideas and opinions have to stand up to close scrutiny, or otherwise what? No one's going to buy them, right? And so what I want to point out is that, like, despite what you may have heard in, I don't know, middle school or high school, everyone's entitled to their own opinions. Everyone's entitled to their own ideas, but it doesn't mean that everyone's ideas and opinions are all the same. It just doesn't mean that. Some ideas and opinions are simply expressed poorly, and therefore they're not that valuable in the marketplace. Some ideas are logically flawed, or based on deeply flawed logic. Some ideas and opinions might be logically sound, might be effectively expressed, but they lack any or all evidence to support them. And some ideas, some opinions are just plain nonsense. And we need to determine whether some ideas or opinions are just plain nonsense. All right, so let's talk about how we do this. So let's get to the intellectual standards here, right? So in general, we refer to these as C.R.A.P. That's obviously an acronym for clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision. So we're going to take these kind of one by one here. And let's start with clarity. So a basic definition of the standard for clarity is a standard by which we judge whether something is understandable, easy to read, easy to hear, and comprehend. Here's a different way of stating the exact same thing, right? Something that is expressed with clarity is easy to apprehend, okay? So for each of these standards as we go through them, I'm going to list a number of criteria or like questions that we can all apply to someone else's thinking or speaking or writing, right? And in the process of doing that, what we're doing is kind of assessing where this thinker stands relative to the standard, okay? So when you're assessing for clarity, basically you're asking yourselves the following question. Does the language used by the thinker help the reader or listener to understand the topic clearly, right? That's simple enough. Are proper grammar and spelling used throughout the piece of writing? Is the writing organized so you can easily kind of transition from one part of an argument or one part of a discussion to another? Do they easily sort of fit together? Can the topic, main points, and evidence be easily figured out? Is the meaning of a sentence easily understood or apprehended? This last one I really want to highlight here. As you can imagine, I've been teaching for more than 20 years. I have graded thousands and thousands and thousands of student papers by this point. And this is a really important standard for me, or criteria for me, that if I'm grading a student's paper and I think to myself, wait a minute, what did that sentence just say? And I go back and I read it a second time. And then I think to myself, I still don't understand what that means. And then if I have to go on and read it a third or a fourth time, that's usually a really reliable indicator to me that there's a lack of clarity as an intellectual standard here for the student's writing, okay? All right, before we move on, there's something that's a little different about the intellectual standard of clarity, and that is that it's often referred to as a gateway standard. It's sometimes referred to as a keystone standard. I don't think that metaphor works as well as the gateway standard, and here's why, right? If a piece of thinking or writing or speaking is clear, then that kind of like opens the gate and you can enter further into the thinking or the writing and assess it for relevance, accuracy, and precision. But if the clarity gate is not open, that it doesn't matter how relevant, accurate, and precise the rest of the reading is. If you can't understand it, then it doesn't matter. It won't make any sense anyway, right? So I don't know if you find that kind of a useful way of thinking about that, but I always have. So clarity is this like gateway standard, the minimum necessary so that people can judge your thinking and your writing based on these other standards, okay? All right, next. In my experience, right, so I've been teaching for more than 20 years, students struggle with clarity more than any of the other intellectual standards. And that's been the case 20 years ago and 15 years ago and 10 years ago, and it's the case now. Students just always struggle with this. If you have received feedback from any of your professors this term on a written paper or some sort of written assignment, and there's been a lack of clarity, some of that feedback might have looked like this, right? So I just kind of use some of the things that I find myself writing in students' papers. So if there are notes in the margins of your papers where it just says, this is confusing, I don't quite follow your logic here, rewrite this sentence, is there a better way of saying this? What do you mean by this? Then that's usually a pretty clear indication that maybe you've fallen a little short on this standard of clarity. I've got some examples here, and so this is where we're going to turn to that reading, so keep it handy. One thing I want to explain about all of my examples, so I'm going to use 2 examples for each of the 4 standards. One thing I want to explain, the first example that I'm going to use is always going to be ridiculous and absurd. So ridiculous and absurd that I hope that the point is obvious. There could be like no mistaking what the point is because it's so ridiculous and obvious. So that's the case here. I remember it was the very first year I was teaching Gen 101. We were going over the intellectual standards in class, and I asked my students, hey, someone give me an example of an unclear sentence. And a student just kind of instantly said, 2 + 2 = fish. And I remember at the time I thought, yeah, that's pretty unclear. That's a really good example, and I've used it as an example ever since. So let's take a look at this, right? So one example of a lack of clarity is this sentence here, 2 + 2 = fish. Now, when you're applying the intellectual standards to someone else's thinking or writing, what you need to do is always provide a rationale or an explanation for your assessment. So if we look at that sentence, 2 + 2 = fish, and it's confusing, it's lacking in clarity for all of us, what we need to do then is explain why it lacks clarity. So this is the example that I've written here. So this sentence is not clear because it's just simply impossible to understand. The word choice is absurd. No matter how many times any one of us in this room reads this sentence, you could read it 100 times, you could read it 1,000 times, it will never make sense. And the reason for that is that the sum of 2 plus 2 can never equal fish, right? So that's a good example of a lack of clarity. Now, let's turn to our craptastic reading, right? And let's take a look at the very first 2 sentences, right? Just so you know, I eliminated the author's name from this reading, and there used to be a URL, like a website that's connected to it. I didn't want anybody to think that I'm picking on someone. This does not come from a student here at Marian. I've eliminated all of that, right? So there's no way that we could like really pick on this person. But everyone read the first 2 sentences. Social media is all the rage. This century has deemed social media as the most valued form of communicating. Now, my issue is with the second sentence. Number one, I'm not sure it's actually accurate, right? Does everyone in the 21st century actually judge social media as the most valued form of communication? But we'll leave that for a second for a different standard. My issue is with the reference to this century. So let me ask you a simple question. What the hell's a century?
100 years.
100 years. It's a length of time. It's a measure of time. Count out 100 years, that's a century, right? Is it possible for a century to do anything? Can it act? Can it judge? Can it hold an opinion? Can it make an argument like a human being? No, right? So what the writer has done here is personified like an inanimate object, given it human characteristics. Now, I'm willing to admit that this isn't like a fatal mistake on the writer's part, but if I was grading this like a professor, I'd have my red pen in my hand and I'd read that sentence and I'd say, wait, this century has deemed social media. What the hell does that mean? And then I'd read it a second time and I'd still be confused. And then I'd read it a third or a fourth time, and that's when I would underline it, draw an arrow to the side and say, rephrase this. This doesn't make sense, okay? All right, so that's clarity. Let's move on to the next standard, and that is relevance. So we covered clarity, we're on to relevance, and the basic definition for relevance is as follows, that this is a standard by which we judge whether all of the elements in the thinking, the speaking, the writing are logically connected to the main point or topic. So you're judging whether all of the words that are used in the thinking and the speaking and the writing are logically connected to the main point or topic. If you've had an assignment returned to you this term with feedback from your professor, and you might be suffering from a lack of relevance, some of that feedback might look like this, right? So when I'm grading students' papers, sometimes I'll just ask the question, how does this relate to the assignment? I don't get it, right? You're talking about something here. I can kind of understand it, but I don't get how it relates to the assignment itself. I might just write something like, explain the relevance of this. Why do you discuss this here? Or what's often very common is what I'll do is I'll draw some arrows or brackets on a student's paper, and I'll ask something like, how is this paragraph above connected to the one below and the one below that, right? And it might be the case that they are, but the student hasn't clearly indicated that in their writing. Okay, so that's what some of that feedback might look like for your professor. This next point is an important one. So as an instructor over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been dealing with more and more cases of students using AI for completing their assignments in my course, even though they are strictly prohibited from doing this, right? One of the things I've noticed about writing that comes from AI is that if a student submits a paper that's completed by AI, there will be whole paragraphs or maybe even whole pages of the assignment that are just totally unrelated to the assignment itself. So that's usually like a dead giveaway for me. And if I see that within a student's paper, I might just kind of bracket something and say, sounds like a computer wrote this, and then I'll ask you to come see me, okay? Let's see. What are the criteria, or what are the questions that we want to apply to other people's thinking and speaking and writing when we're trying to judge for relevance? This is all pretty straightforward. We're asking ourselves, do all parts of the writing lead logically to the topic or to the conclusion? Are there sentences, paragraphs, or sections which appear to be unrelated to the topic? Are there sentences or paragraphs that just simply seem out of place? So sometimes I'll do that. I'll suggest this is a good paragraph to a student, but then I'll say, but it belongs closer to the top of the paper. Does the new subject matter just kind of pop up in a piece of thinking without being signaled by the thinker? And then this last one's important. Again, when I'm grading papers, often what I'm doing is if I need to reread a sentence or a whole paragraph 2 or 3 or 4 times to try and figure out how it's related to the rest of the paper, that's usually a sign that you're not writing with relevance, okay? All right, so let's use some examples here to help illustrate. Now remember, my first example is always ridiculous and absurd. All right, so my first example here, let's pretend that I'm writing a paper on Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. And I start my paper out by writing, Karl Marx is the author of the Communist Manifesto. My cat's name is Mittens. Karl Marx published the manifesto in 1848, right? So we can all see how absurd this is. And if I was to write out a rationale or an explanation as to why some of that is not relevant, I'd write something like this. The name of my cat is not logically connected with the discussion on the Communist Manifesto. I didn't signal to the reader in the greater context of the discussion that I would be talking about both the Communist Manifesto and the name of my cat at one and the same time. Now, one thing to point out, I may actually own a cat named Mittens, and that makes that sentence what?
True.
Accurate, truthfully, factually accurate, but it's also not relevant to any sort of discussion on the Communist Manifesto, right? So it's unrelated to the topic at hand. All right, so that's my absurd example. Let's look at our craptastic example. So everyone turn to the second paragraph, the very top of the sentence paragraph, second paragraph, and I'll read this out. So the users of Facebook toss discretion out as they explore private matters on the pages of Facebook for all the world to see. What happened to modest behavior? It's clear modest behavior does not exist on the pages of Facebook. Isn't everyone on Facebook? What's the problem there? What's the problem? This question, isn't everyone on Facebook, is totally unrelated to the idea of modesty on Facebook, right? So the fancy Latin term that we would use to describe this situation is that last sentence, isn't everyone on Facebook? This is a non sequitur. And the fancy Latin term for that is it does not follow. That's what non sequitur means in Latin. It does not follow. So in other words, this question is not connected in a logical way to the sentences that went before it. They were all about discretion or private matters and modesty on Facebook. And then at the end, the writer just asked, isn't everybody on Facebook? And I'm like, how the hell is that relevant, right? All right, so we have now covered clarity. We have now covered relevance. Let's move on to the next one, and that is accuracy. So our basic definition for accuracy is as follows, right? A standard by which we can judge whether the information that's provided by a thinker, a speaker, or a writer is correct, is plausible, is well established, or could be regarded as factual. Okay, so it's a standard that we use for judging whether the words that are used by a thinker, a writer, or a speaker are correct, plausible, well-established, or factual. Now, I got a bit of good news here, actually. After more than 20 years of teaching history, students in my history classes in general don't really struggle with accuracy. I think that's a good thing, right? They generally use like historical information or factual information in their papers in a way that's perfectly consistent with this standard of accuracy. So that's the good news. But it still happens that students might use information sort of inaccurately. So when that happens, I might write some comments like this. Most commonly, I probably just underline a sentence and just say, no, this is not accurate. I might say, wait, what? What are you arguing here? If I don't quite understand what's being argued, rethink this, not accurate, check your facts. I think it's always kind of amusing to find out that Martin Luther was born in like the 1800s or the 19th century rather than in the 14th century. And so I'll just kind of say, really? Was he really born in the 1800s? The criteria for judging accuracy consist of the following. Again, so there are a series of questions, right? We need to apply to our own thinking and other people's thinking. So we're asking ourselves, when it comes to accuracy, is there any exaggeration? Is there a distortion of reality that maybe the author is engaged in? Are there any statements that we know can be proven false? Can I easily verify the information that's used? The thinker's argument can be verified and then make sure it's not characterized by distortion. So again, let me use some examples to help illustrate. Remember, my first example is always kind of absurd here, okay? So my first example of something that's not accurate reads as follows. So French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was an excellent basketball player because he was a very tall man. And so if I needed to demonstrate by applying the intellectual standard of accuracy that this is not accurate, I would write out something like this, that this statement is not accurate for two reasons. First, anybody with a laptop right here can look up the date when basketball was invented or created for the first time. And if you do that, you can easily verify that the game of basketball was invented, 60 years, more than 70 years after Napoleon's death, right? So that makes it not accurate. In addition, you could easily argue that while there's kind of scholarly disagreement among historians as to how tall Napoleon was, some people argue he was 5'2", other people argue, no, he was much taller, he was 5'7". In any case, you can't argue that Napoleon was a very tall man because that, again, is easy to verify, okay? So again, I've used an absurd example to help make the point, but let's go to our craptastic example here. And I'm going to draw everyone's attention to the second to last paragraph. So let me read this aloud, the second to last paragraph. There is something antisocial about social media. After all, everyone that is not part of social media is ostracized and shunned for not being part of the gossip mill and the frenzied search for too much information. Now, what's inaccurate about that? What makes that a distortion of reality? Listen, I've had students in the past who have told me, I don't use any social media. Does anybody in here not use social media? I count myself as one of them. Are you shunned and ostracized by all persons that you encounter? I don't use social media. As far as I know, I haven't been shunned and ostracized yet. I'm sure there's some people who would like to shun or ostracize me, right? In addition, I think we all probably know someone, a family member, a friend, a teammate, a workmate. They don't use social media. Are they shunned and ostracized? Right, so that's easy to demonstrate that this is a distortion of reality. It's a clear exaggeration, and it cannot be proven true or factual. Okay? All right, let's move on to our last standard. So that was accuracy. Now we're on to precision. This is the last one. My definition for precision is as follows, is that precision is a standard by which we can judge whether the thinking is detailed, that's an important one, double underline that, focused, specific, and exact. So precision, in other words, refers to giving the details that are needed for someone to fully understand exactly what's meant in someone's thinking, speaking, or writing. It's about depth of detail. All right, so I explained some good news about accuracy. In my experience, generally students don't struggle with accuracy. But next to clarity, this is the one that students really kind of struggle with in my history classes over and over again, right? And so signs of a lack of precision when you get a paper back or an assignment back from one of your professors might look like this, right? So if I think a student hasn't been precise enough in his or her argument or in their paper, I might say, this is a good idea, but explain this in more detail, or this is a good point, but you need to expand / elaborate on this, explain this fully, explain this in detail. This is a big one. If you've taken a history class from me, you know that whatever you argue, you can argue whatever you want as long as it's logically sound and as long as you're using evidence from the readings. And so often what I find is that students make sound, logical arguments in their papers, but then they neglect to use any evidence from the primary source reading to support their argument. So I'm often writing this: use specific examples or evidence from the reading in order to support this idea or to help illustrate this idea. Often I'll write, right? Because someone will propose something that I think is really kind of an interesting idea, but then I'll need the student to explain a little bit more so that I fully understand it in detail. Or I might just say something like, hey, this needs more attention. You just kind of skipped over this point and it needs more attention. Some of the criteria. So again, these are kind of the questions or the ideas that we're applying to thinking and speaking and writing to kind of get an idea. Does this measure up to the standard of precision? And so what you want to ask yourself is the thinking free of cliches, of jargon, of ambiguous language? What's jargon? Does anybody know what jargon is? Everyone's always afraid. Yeah, go ahead.
Specialized terms that normal people don't.
Yeah, really kind of specialized, I mean, super specialized terms, right? That someone within a particular trade or a profession or an academic discipline might know only for themselves, right? So in generally, for a broader audience, what you want to do is stay away from that kind of jargon. Man, you also want to stay away from cliches. Students are drawn to cliches like moths to a flame. I'll explain this in a second, but that's just kind of tired, worn out language that's not very illuminating, so you want to stay away from that. I've got another suggestion here, right? If ever you're going to use numbers or proportions or percentages, do it exactly, do it precisely. So if you want to make an argument about like a percentage of the American population that believes something, use an actual number, right? So 75% of Americans believe, that's a precise number. But arguing something like many Americans believe, that's just not precise enough. And I might underline that and say, be more exact, right, on this. Don't use words that have more than one meaning, or at least more than one meaning within a particular context of an assignment. Make sure that you're always using examples and evidence to help illustrate your point, right? This is super important for students. And make sure that you're providing that level of detail that's necessary for a listener or a reader to fully understand your logic, right? And make sure that all of your ideas that are really vital to your argument are explored in depth. All right, so let me use some examples. Remember, my first example is always kind of ridiculous. And so my first example goes like this. Students are drawn to trite expressions like moths to a flame, right? I'm beginning to realize that students don't understand this cliche. Has anybody ever heard this before? About someone or something being drawn like moths to a flame? Yeah, what does it mean?
I don't know, moths like lights.
Yeah, like your front porch light, right? And you can't reason with a moth, right? A moth is going to be drawn to that light. But in the old days, right, the light that was used mostly came from a flame, like a candle or something like that. And the idea here is that a moth might be drawn to a flame, but also what's that flame do to a moth? Yeah, it burns the moth, okay? All right, so enough of that. If I had to write a rationale as to why I thought that that sentence kind of lacked in precision, I would write something like this, that the author's argument employs a tired and sort of worn out expression, that is a cliche, in order to argue against the use of trite expressions, right? So the author's argument would be more exact and detailed if he or she stated her case with more original language, right? So the phrase like moth to a flame is inexact and should be replaced with more specific, but also this is your opportunity to use stronger language, not just more specific language. All right, let's return to our craptastic example. And let's look at the very last paragraph, and this is a doozy. Social media should only be used to promote social behavior. What's the problem? Where's the lack of precision there? What the hell does social behavior mean, right? I mean, I can think of at least 3 things that might describe social behavior, right? So is social behavior behavior that's influenced by broad social forces? Is that what that means? Is social behavior behavior that is positive in nature instead of just like negative in nature? I have no idea because the author didn't explain this, right? Perhaps social behavior is behavior that takes place in a direct face-to-face like human contact. Maybe that's what the author means by social behavior. But the way this is written, it falls short of precision because none of us in this room, we could read that sentence 1,000 times, right? None of us in this room are going to know what the author means because of a lack of precision. Does that make sense? All right, one last slide, okay? And it goes like this. There's a lot here. So remember that in your Scoop 100 sections over the next day or two, some of you are going to have library sessions first, but you're going to be applying the intellectual standards in your Scoop 100 sections. Remember, this is not mean, right? This is not hating on someone for the sake of hating on someone. Instead, you're critiquing someone's thinking and writing and speaking in order to not only improve their thinking, writing, and speaking, but your own. You need to habituate yourself to doing this in your own work. Everybody's packing up, and I got 4 minutes left. Okay, stop packing up. Over the next couple days, you're going to be asked to do this. Let me give you some simple tips or suggestions to make this easier for you. Here's a list of things that you cannot use for judging crap. In other words, there's a list of things that are totally unrelated to crap. So if you're asked to read an article by one of your professors and then apply crap, don't make your judgments based on this. Don't make your judgments based on the article and its length. Like, oh, this article is really long, so it's imprecise. Don't do that, okay? Or don't make a judgment on crap as to whether you think the article was helpful to you or not, or appealing to you or not. That doesn't matter. What you're judging is clarity, relevance, accuracy, precision. Don't judge an article and try to apply crap by simply asking yourself, well, can I really relate to this? That's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with crap. Apply just clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision. A couple other interesting or useful tips here, right? And I think this one is really important. Practice using sentence stems, like the beginnings of sentences, and this will make it easier for you to apply crap. So you might just head into an assignment, read a selection, and say, this sentence lacks clarity because, and then what you need to do, your role there is to finish that sentence and then use a specific example or evidence from a reading or thinking in order to support that. So I strongly encourage students, use these sentence stems. They're your friends here. And all you gotta do is just like finish the half-completed sentence. The last thing to think about is this, and that is you always need to provide a rationale. And I tried to do this for each of our examples. So what you want to do is write out a sentence or two explaining why you believe a sentence or an element of a reading falls short on the intellectual standards, and then use evidence or examples to support your case. All right, one last slide. We don't have time for this, but I anticipated that maybe we're going to have time. But man, I think this would be fun. When all of you meet up with your Scoop 100 instructors later this week, you should apply the intellectual standards to my presentation. Were there any instances where I fell short on clarity, relevance, accuracy, and precision, right? And if I did, identify which element I fell short on, write it out, write a sentence or two, give a specific example to help illustrate how I fell short on this. I don't know if any of you will actually do it, but that sounds like fun to me. Doesn't that sound like fun? All right, I finished right on time. I will let you all go. Have a good afternoon.